Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here at the National History Academy, and we are back in the new year with our virtual tour through American history sites across the country. And today we are joined by Jasmine Learn from Lincoln Home National Historic Site. So Jasmine, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me here today. So as Katie mentioned, I'm Jasmine. I'm a park ranger at Lincoln Home National Historic Site in Central Illinois. It's the house where Abraham Lincoln and his family lived in the 17 years right before he became president. So where he was a lawyer, kind of rising politician, and kind of spent his adult years, really formative years leading up to the presidency. And we're just really happy to share with you a little bit more about Abraham Lincoln and his life here today.
Perfect. And we're going to start today with a pre-recorded video from Lincoln Home. And there will be a Q&A session at the end with Jasmine. So if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to add them in the chat and we'll get those answered for you.
Hello everyone, welcome to Lincoln Home National Historic Site. I'm Ranger Jasmine and I'll be your guide today through our tour of the Lincoln Home. If you haven't already guessed, this house behind me is the Lincoln Home. It is the first and only home Abraham Lincoln owned. He, his wife Mary, and his first son Robert moved into this house in 1844, buying it for only $1,500. At that point, it was a lot smaller than it is today. It was a much simpler 1.5-story cottage. But eventually, as Abraham Lincoln's law career flourished and their family grew, they were able to afford to expand the home, enlarging the bottom floor and converting that 1.5 stories to a full 2 stories, among other renovations. Today, the house as we see it, with its tan siding, darker trim, green shutters, and 2 chimneys, has been restored inside and out to look as close as possible to how the home would have looked when Abraham Lincoln and his family lived here in 1860, the year he was elected to the presidency. Today, as we go through the home, we'll explore how artifacts and stories of the past can give us insight into Abraham Lincoln and his family. And then we'll also get a special behind-the-scenes look at some artifacts not normally on display to the public. And then lastly, we'll wrap up by stopping at a couple other places on site, which, while not within the Lincoln Home, continue the larger legacy Lincoln has left behind of civil rights, freedom, and opportunity. Without further ado, let's get started. Seeing as you folks are the guests of the Lincoln Home today, it was only fitting that we start out in the rooms where Abraham Lincoln and Mary would have brought their guests. These 2 adjoined rooms are the formal parlor rooms. Right now I'm standing in the front parlor, and behind me is the back. Taking a look around, you probably noticed there's a lot to see here in these rooms. From the framed pictures on the walls, the ornate black cushioned stately furniture that includes couches, chairs, footstools, and rockers, and all the countless knickknacks on the shelves around the room. There's the fireplaces in both the front and back, with the front boasting an ornate black wood burning stove, while the back parlor also has a marble-topped table and a wooden bookcase with books behind glass. All this opulence is probably giving you the impression that the Lincolns were quite well off. And Abraham Lincoln did make decent money as a lawyer, especially in the later years in the home. However, these rooms in particular had some of the most nicest and expensive furniture in the home. These rooms are where they met with and entertained their guests, and therefore it was decked out to impress. Abraham Lincoln may have also met with political allies or some of his law clients in these rooms, and therefore they had to be comfortable and classy. But it wasn't only formal meetings here. They also had parties, get-togethers, and social events. On one account, Mary Lincoln invited an astonishing 500 guests for a party here in these rooms. But due to an unlucky rain, only 300 showed up. You might be wondering, how do they fit 300 people in this house, much less these 2 rooms? However, back then, at this time, the party was more of a stop by, nibble on something, maybe chat for a bit before being on your merry way, rather than a stay the whole evening kind of affair. Even if Mary Lincoln did not get the attendance that she wanted, she must have been quite the hostess to pull off such a feat. But while there are echoes of laughter and merriment in these rooms, there are also unfortunately memories of tragedy and sadness. The Lincoln's second son, Eddie, passed away in this home when he was around 3 years old. At the time, the back parlor was a bedroom where he likely passed away. And then it was in this room, the front parlor, where the funeral service was held. Can you imagine all the memories in these rooms, the conflicting emotions? Just like every home, the Lincoln home mingled with joy and sadness. Now that we've had a look at the front parlor, let's take a few steps into the back. The back parlor functioned similarly to the front parlor, but sometimes it was also used as a private meeting area or Abraham Lincoln's study. In such cases, they could close off these doors, separating the front from the back. One of the most important meetings held here, as well as one of the highlights of Abraham Lincoln's political career, happened in this room. It was when Abraham Lincoln was offered the formal nomination to run for President of the United States by the Republican nomination committee. For years, Abraham Lincoln had fought and struggled and played the political game. He had served many years in the state legislature and one term in the House of Representatives. But he had also failed twice to win the U.S. Senate seat, often overshadowed by his rival, Stephen Douglas. And yet, roughly 10 years later in this room, he was being offered the opportunity to run for the highest position in the United States. How do you think he felt? Excited? Triumphant? How would have you felt if someone asked you to run for president? Nervous, perhaps? Now let's think about the context in which Abraham Lincoln was offered this opportunity. The nation was becoming increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. And Abraham Lincoln knew many people did not agree with his position that slavery should no longer be allowed to expand. He knew it would not be an easy presidency. And although he may not have foreseen the upcoming Civil War, he knew the presidency would be a big responsibility as well as a burden, and that this would be one of the biggest decisions in his life. So how did Abraham Lincoln respond? He actually already knew that the nomination committee was on their way to offer him this opportunity, and yet he waited. He asked for more time. He didn't accept until 4 days later. Perhaps some of this was political savviness, but perhaps some of this is also that pause that we all experience, that we all feel when faced with a difficult decision. We've all had points in our lives. We have to make a life-changing decision, and we also hesitate. We want more time to think about it, even if we ultimately know in our hearts what our decision is going to be. But in the end, after 4 days, Abraham Lincoln formally accepted. He ran for president that November, and the rest, you could say, is history. Now, after all these parties and meetings, everyone's tired. They want to relax, unwind with the family. Let's see the room where they're going to do that next. Though we might call it a living room, a family room, or a den area today, this is basically a place your family and close family friends can relax and spend time together. Now let's take a look around. How is this room different from the formal parlor rooms? Definitely less decorated. Gone are all the wall adornments, the countless knickknacks. Those high-backed black cushion chairs are replaced with caned woven seating ones. But even though there are less things in this room, there are still quite a few items which can hint at what the Lincolns did back then. There's a sewing table over there by the mirror, a chess set on the table. Some of the things they might have done back then might not be too different from what we like to do with our friends and family today. They didn't have electricity back then, so unfortunately no TV, no movies, no video games, but they still found ways to amuse themselves. Without all that fancy, expensive furniture, the Lincoln boys were free to roll around in roughhouse. You might find them wrestling around here on the carpet with their father, or playing with the family dog, Fido. And when they get tired out, they can curl around the fireplace to hear their father read a story. Abraham Lincoln, he loved to read. For him, reading was more than just a pastime. It was a key to his education and his success. Growing up, Abraham Lincoln did not have much of a formal education and only had roughly 1 year of school. So for him, books were a way to cultivate his intellect and curiosity. It was thanks to them that he was able to become the successful lawyer and politician we know him as today. But when he did want a bit of leisure reading, he often liked to read poet Robert Burns or Shakespeare, and it is likely that some of those authors were the ones right here in this room. If the Lingan boys didn't want to play a quiet game of chess, were tired of wrestling, and sick of their father's books, then they might be found playing with this contraption over here on the table. Back then, there was no, again, video games, movies, so this was the entertainment system of the home. It's called a stereoscope, and it's kind of like what some of you may know as a Viewmaster. How it would work is you would get one of these cards with the 2 mirror images on it and put it in the box, and then look through that lens. And then the image would appear in fabulous 3D. Think of it kind of like a super, super low-tech virtual reality. Basically, a 3D picture viewer. And it was very, very expensive. $20 to $25 back then. Today, that's like buying a fancy flat screen TV, new and shiny. But instead of a TV which the whole family can enjoy, this is just a toy for the children. I'm sure the Lingan boys were the envy of all the other kids on the block. But maybe some of the adults shook their heads, thinking Abraham Lincoln was spoiling his children. But I like to think that Abraham Lincoln was just reflecting back onto his own childhood, where books were few and far between, much less a fancy stereoscope. And so he just wanted to indulge his kids a little bit in that lifestyle he did not have growing up. After all, like most parents, he wanted the best for his children. After a long day of playing in the evening, parties during the day, everyone is getting really tired. And now it's time to retire to the more private areas of the home. So we're going to head upstairs next. This room here, with its gold and blue elaborate wallpaper, ornate wooden furniture, and fireplace with a wood-burning stove, is Abraham Lincoln's bedroom. It was in this room where he would get up, get ready for the day, and then in the evenings retire to in order to rest. Abraham Lincoln, as we know, was a very hardworking man. Sometimes instead of immediately going to sleep, he would still stay up and work. Right here is his original writing desk with its small wooden sides and pigeonhole cubbies. You can imagine him sitting here sometimes as late as 2 a.m., 3 a.m., working on innumerable law cases and drafting some political speeches. It is even possible that he may have drafted parts of his famous House Divided speech here, where he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to dissolve. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." In this speech, Abraham Lincoln referenced the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott case. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing new states to vote on whether they wanted to become free states or slave states, a term or a practice termed popular sovereignty. The Dred Scott case was where the Supreme Court decided that the defendant, Dred Scott, a slave who was suing for his freedom, could not sue because African Americans, they said, were not citizens of the United States. They also declared that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional. Republicans such as Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to stop the expansion of slavery, were infuriated by these events. They saw these as steps towards expanding slavery into the entire United States. As Abraham Lincoln had warned, it will become all one thing or all the other. I can imagine Abraham Lincoln having many sleepless and stressful nights, where even after he puts down his papers, he wonders what will become of the nation and what will become of the national issue of slavery. After every stressful evening, though, eventually Abraham Lincoln has to get up and get ready for the day. It was in this corner where he would have washed up in the morning. We can see a wash basin, a jug, and then on the wall hanging a shaving mirror. This shaving mirror is hung at the height that Abraham Lincoln would have used it at. It was 6 foot 4 inches. Compared to my height, 5 feet 3 inches, it can give you an idea of how tall he actually was, as I wouldn't even be able to see my own face in the mirror. Speaking of shaving, you might be a little surprised to hear that Abraham Lincoln was shaving off his stubble every morning. He only started growing out that famous beard when an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell wrote him a letter suggesting that he do so. Her reasoning was that Abraham Lincoln would look so much more handsome with a beard, and if he was more handsome, the women of the United States would tease their husbands into voting for him to become president. To Grace's surprise and delight, Abraham Lincoln not only wrote her back, but took her advice. I like to think that it is not only thanks to Grace that Abraham Lincoln threw out those famous whispers, but that she also may have brought him a moment of amusement at her earnest suggestion during such a stressful time. This room here is Mary Lincoln's bedroom, adjacent to Abraham Lincoln's. These two bedrooms made up the master suite, which you can kind of tell as they have the same gold and blue patterned wallpaper, and her room is furnished similarly with ornate wooden furniture and a wood-burning stove. Mary Lincoln was used to nice spaces such as these, as she grew up in wealth and luxury. In contrast, Abraham Lincoln, who, as we know, grew up relatively poor in a log cabin. However, given Abraham Lincoln's rising prominence as a lawyer and politician during this time, I'm sure both Abraham and Mary likely wanted their interior to reflect their rising socioeconomic status. Mary and Abraham not only had different socioeconomic backgrounds, but educational backgrounds as well. As we mentioned earlier, Abraham Lincoln had roughly 1 year of formal education, while Mary had roughly 12 years of schooling, which was especially unusual for a woman during this time period. Mary Lincoln shared Abraham's intellectual mind and interest in politics, which I'm sure is among the many reasons how she caught his eye. But despite their differences, she remained loyal and supportive of her husband. She helped him with his political ambitions and stood staunchly by his side during the Civil War, even when some of her own relatives sided with the Confederacy. Of marriage, she once said, "I would rather marry a poor man, a man of mind, with the hope and bright prospects ahead for position, fame, and power, than to marry all the houses of gold." And her choice of Abraham Lincoln would prove to be just that. This room is down the hall from Mary's room. It is the boys' room. Originally, it was Robert Lincoln's room, the eldest son of the Lincolns, while his two younger brothers, Willie and Tad, would have stayed on a bed that pulled out from underneath their mothers, called a trundle bed. Eventually, though, Robert went off to college, so Willie and Tad got to take this room after he left. Whenever he came home to visit, he would have to stay in the guest bedroom, a larger and nicer room across the hall from his father's, with that stately black cushioned furniture and a sleigh bed. Back here in this room, today it is restored to look like how it may have when Willie and Tad had this room. Hence all the toys scattered about. You can see a cup and ball on the chair, toy soldiers and checkers by the window, alphabet blocks on the floor, and a glimpse of the hoops at the foot of the bed, giving us an idea of some of the toys and games the children would have played with back then. Willie and Tad, like their father, loved a good laugh. While Abraham Lincoln was known for his lighthearted and humorous stories, his two youngest children were known better for their mischievous pranks and tendency to get into trouble. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, recalls them making an absolute mess of the law office without so much of a scolding from their father. Of his rather lenient parenting style, Abraham Lincoln said, "It is my pleasure that my children are free and happy and unrestrained from parental tyranny. Love is the chain whereby to bind a child to its parents." This room here is the last bedroom of the Lincoln home. More simply furnished, smaller, with just some simple storage furniture pieces, a rocking chair, washstand, and low bed. This room would have been for the last potential occupant of the Lincoln home, a hired help, sometimes known as the hired girl. Back then, during this time, there was no electricity or running water, so the chores were endless, especially the dreaded laundry day. It was not uncommon for middle and upper class families to hire a woman to help with chores around the house, such as laundry, cooking, cleaning, serving, shopping, sewing, and childcare. The Lincolns would have paid the hired help $1 to $1.50 per week for her services. And if she needed it, she could use this room as room and board. Not all of the hired help stayed in this room, however. Some of them only came in once a week. Some of them had their own homes and families. But some of them were also immigrants, often from Ireland. and staying in the Lingan home may have been more the convenient and affordable option for them. But despite their status as hired help, they still had a significant impact on the Lingan family's lives. One hired help, Mariah Vance, worked for the Lingan for 10 years and had a significant impact on Robert Lingan, the oldest son's life. Later, when he was all grown up and he was president of the Pullman Car Company, he came to visit her in her home then in Danville, Illinois, and shared a meal with her and caught up. Afterwards, he put her on the Pullman Car Company's pension as a way to show his appreciation for all her years of service during his childhood. Our last stop inside the house is the kitchen and dining room. The dining room is adjacent to the kitchen and has a dining table, sideboard, and game table with china and dishes for the food. Back here in the kitchen, we have a stove, cupboard, dry sink, and table for food prep. This ornate cast iron wood burning stove, taking up a good portion of the room, is the original cook stove that the Lincolns used in 1860, the year Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency. I'm sure Mary and the hired help put this stove to good use, preparing many meals for get-togethers and parties leading up to the election. Abraham Lincoln liked foods such as oysters, venison, corned beef and cabbage, other hearty and delicious Midwestern foods such as beef, chicken, pork, potatoes, and corn. For dessert, Mary Lincoln may have prepared her famous white almond cake, said to be one of Abraham Lincoln's favorites. For many of us, food and family meals may bring back many happy memories. But for Abraham Lincoln, this room may also have reminded him of his relatively humble origins. For this kitchen, this room here, is roughly the same size as the log cabin that Abraham Lincoln was born in. 4 to 8 people lived in the building the size of roughly this room when Abraham Lincoln was growing up. But despite his humble beginnings, Abraham Lincoln worked hard, persevered, became a successful lawyer, bought a 1.5-story cottage, and then was able to later upgrade it into this beautiful home that we stand here today, before moving on to the even greater, grander White House. In this way, Abraham Lincoln's home reflects his story that no matter how humble our origins, if we work hard, persevere, and do what we believe is right, we too can achieve greatness, just like Lincoln did. Many Lincoln artifacts still exist in the Lincoln home today, including much of the furniture we saw on our tour. However, many more artifacts are not located in the home itself, but in our special collections storage. Let's now take a look behind the scenes to see some artifacts which, while they do not belong to Abraham Lincoln himself, still play a part in his larger presidential story. Hello, everyone. We're here in the artifact collection storage with our curator, Susan Haig. And hi. And Susan's going to show us some special artifacts related to Abraham Lincoln's 1860 election.
Well, hello, everyone. As Jasmine said, I am Susan Haig. I'm the curator here. And we're going to be talking about one of our biggest pieces from the 1860 election. This is a banner that probably would have been hanging maybe at a rally or some other kind of event that you would have had big things like a banner and signs and things, you know, on walls. This wouldn't necessarily be something you put in your yard, but you would have it maybe in somewhere that you could see it fairly often. So it is shaped like a US flag to some extent. You can see there's the blue wool over here and then the red and white stripes. There aren't 13 stripes. And it is backwards. We don't know why, except maybe it's supposed to hang so that the blue was up here on the wall. But it says Lincoln and Hamlin, and Hannibal Hamlin was Lincoln's first vice president. He was from Maine. He had been a congressman or a senator, off the top of my head, I don't remember. But he was put on the ticket to kind of help balance the Western Abraham Lincoln with a Northeastern, another politician from the Northeast, to kind of try to get as many people interested, geographically at least, in what they were saying. Now, this banner does have an interesting history. We don't know what it was used for originally, but it was found in the haymow of a barn. So the top of a barn where all the hay is stored for the winter, kind of stuffed back in a corner. And it was discovered by a young man when he was about 14 or 15 years old in his grandfather's barn in St. Charles, Missouri. Now, he did a little bit of research when he found this and discovered that his grandfather was actually not a fan of Abraham Lincoln's. He was a Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a Republican. So did he see this banner someplace and tear it down and stuff it into the barn so that no one else could use it? We don't know. But the young man did find it. He saved it. He built a frame for it in his high school shop class. And then in the early 1990s, he brought it. He brought his family to the Lincoln home to visit and happened to mention to one of the rangers who was giving him his tour that he had this thing he found in his grandfather's barn, and would we be interested in it? We obviously were very interested in it. And a couple of years ago, we had it conserved and we put it on display for the first time in February of 2009 in honor of Abraham Lincoln's 200th birthday. We're going from one of our largest campaign items to some of our smallest campaign items. The campaign of 1860 had 4 major candidates running for office. They were the Republican Abraham Lincoln, the Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrat John Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Union, which was a very small faction of the Democratic Party, that's John Bell. And these little items are called donut ferrotypes. You can kind of see the donut effect with the brass frame around each of them. And the ferrotype is the type of photograph that was used. So those are actually very tiny little photographs set into these brass frames. And you'll notice there's a hole on top of each one of them. So you could wear them, if you were a gentleman, you could maybe wear it like a pin on your lapel of your coat. If you were a lady, you could run a ribbon through that hole, wear it as a necklace or a bracelet to help show your support of your particular candidate. They were extremely popular. Hundreds of thousands of these were made for all of the different candidates. You can still find them very easily now for many, many of the campaigns, not just the 1860 campaign. Now, what's interesting is, like I said, it has pictures on each side. So we have Abraham Lincoln, and there's Hannibal Hamlin, his running mate from Maine. We have Stephen Douglas, who was also from Illinois, and his running mate, Herschel Johnson from Georgia. Then we have John Breckinridge, who is from Kentucky, and his running mate, Joseph Lane from Oregon. And then John Bell, who is originally from Tennessee, and his running mate, Edward Everett, who is from Massachusetts. Now, Edward Everett and Abraham Lincoln would meet again after the 1860 election. Edward Everett was a very famous speaker. He would come and talk about almost any topic for hours on end as a public event. So Edward Everett was the featured speaker in Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863 at the dedication of the cemetery. And of course, Mr. Lincoln had just been asked to say a few remarks after Mr. Everett. And that became, of course, the famous Gettysburg Address. So there are still some connections going on between the 1860 candidates even after the war.
Well, thanks so much, Susan, for showing us these artifacts.
You're welcome. Come back anytime.
Now, before we wrap up our tour, I would like us to make a couple of stops on site, which go beyond the story of Abraham Lincoln, and continue and connect instead to the larger story of civil rights and equal opportunity for all that Abraham Lincoln worked so hard to help this nation achieve.
This empty, unassuming grass lot behind me is called the Jenkins Law. It's a few properties south of the Lincoln home, and it was here that a man named Jameson Jenkins lived. Jenkins was a free African-American man who was a drayman by trade. A drayman is an individual who uses a horse-drawn wagon to provide transportation services for goods and people. This job would have been a perfect cover-up for another service he provided, being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. In January of 1850, while Abraham Lincoln still lived on the street, reports came out in the local newspaper of an incident in which they termed a slave stamp, describing how a group of escaped slaves from St. Louis were running away north to Bloomington, Illinois. In the following days, contradictory reports appeared, some claiming that the slaves had been betrayed by someone and caught. However, it was later confirmed that 8 slaves had successfully escaped north, heavily implying that Jamison Jenkins had been the one who had helped them. We do not know if Abraham Lincoln knew Jamison Jenkins may have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. They were neighbors, and at the very least acquaintances, as Jenkins' mother-in-law, Jane Pelham, worked for the Lincolns in their home at one point. And he also gave Abraham Lincoln a ride to the Great Western Depot on the day Abraham Lincoln left for Washington, D.C. Regardless, I would like to think that if Abraham Lincoln knew of Jenkins' actions, he would be proud, as both these men, Lincoln and Jenkins, in their own but different ways, played important roles in the journey of African Americans to freedom. Our last stop today is the Rosenwald House, across the street from the Lincoln. This house was the boyhood home of Julius Rosenwald, a man who would grow up to be president of Sears Roebuck Company, and also can be considered one of America's most influential philanthropists of the 20th century. Julius Rosenwald was born in Springfield, Illinois in 1862, while Abraham Lincoln was president. His family moved here a few years later in 1869. Sometimes called America's first social philanthropist, Rosenwald donated around $60 million during his lifetime, about $1 billion in today's currency. Among his contributions, Rosenwald was famous for helping to fund thousands of schools for African Americans in the segregated South, the Rosenwald schools, under the guidance and in cooperation with Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee Institute, and local African American communities. Rosenwald also helped fund fellowships for African American academics and artists, built an affordable housing complex in Chicago known as the Rosenwald Courts, and donated several $1 million to the construction of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. Although Rosenwald never met Lincoln in person, in a way, he embodied the spirit of Lincoln through his projects that expanded opportunities for African Americans during a time when segregation and discrimination were still allowed under the law. On his last day here in Springfield, as Abraham Lincoln got ready to board the train that would take him away to Washington, D.C., he turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness his departure, giving them one last farewell speech for the last time. Within it, he said, "To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived for a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried." With these words, Abraham Lincoln was reflecting on the 17 years he had lived in this house and the roughly 25 years he had lived in this home. Growing up in a log cabin, moving from place to place as a child and young adult, and never really having a place to call his own, Abraham Lincoln likely considered this house and the city of Springfield his home. It was where he raised his children, where he rose to prominence and emerged as a leader during a time of emerging national crisis. Abraham Lincoln knew there was a daunting task ahead, admitting in the same speech that "I may leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." The task would be difficult, perhaps even more difficult than Abraham Lincoln could have ever imagined. But eventually, he was able to help end this American Civil War, issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and help pass the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States. Today, the legacy Abraham Lincoln has come to represent lives on through stories of him, his family, his home, and his Springfield community. And it is built on and continued through stories of people like Jamison Jenkins, Julius Rosenwald, and through us. I hope today you have gotten the chance to see Abraham Lincoln in a new light, not just as a father, husband, president, or leader, but also just as another ordinary person who we all try to represent the ideals of today.
Jasmine, that was such an informative video. Thank you for sharing that with us. We really appreciate it. And now I'm going to invite on Ben Kellerholz. He's our intern here at the National History Academy, and he's going to be helping us with the Q&A. So I think we've got some good questions, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Jasmine. And so let's get right into it. Let's see, our first question is, we had another program with Lincoln's Cottage in DC, and we go there every summer as part of the National History Academy. How does your site, or does it, work with other Lincoln homes or sites around the country?
Yeah, since we are a national park site, we work more with other Lincoln-related national park sites a little bit. Sometimes when there's a national kind of Lincoln program, I think several years ago for like the anniversary of the funeral, like the sites work together on some things. Also, here in Springfield, Illinois, our town here, the city we're located in, there's also other Lincoln-related sites. They're mostly state sites, so like his presidential museum is here, so we work together with a lot of these local state sites due to proximity and stuff. So most of our major collaborative programming is mostly either in town or occasionally with some of the other national parks Lincoln sites.
Interesting. Another thing we look at with all of our sites with the History Academy and our virtual programs is how the recent conversations about history and these sites have been very politicized. With someone that might be one of the most famous historical figures and beloved in American history, how have your interactions with visitors been or changed? Have they in the last 3-4 years?
Yeah, well, I guess I can't speak for super long term. I've only been at this site for about 2.5 years. So I can only personally speak from, what I've noticed these past couple of years or so. And we were closed down for a good chunk of it. But, since we are a presidential site and, the world, a lot has gone on in the world politically since then, we do occasionally, have people commenting on or asking us about, what would Lincoln think about our current times, or, his opinion on political matters. And it's really hard to, say that because, there's been 200 years since Lincoln was around. The country, the world, and our political system is very different from how it was today. So we can't really give a good answer usually when people ask about that. And as the federal government, we have to be kind of careful when we're talking about politics because we are the government and such. But we do get questions like that very often. People, of course, like to make comparisons to Lincoln and, the modern politicians and, the how they were very, the Civil War was literally the country splitting up. And, sometimes today it feels like our country is again going through, a lot of, it's very partisan now. And sometimes it also feels a bit like we're very separated today as well.
Right. So those dialogues will probably only increase as you go along. Let's see, what insights into his personality do you think come across strongest through the home?
Yes, I think for me, the ones that stand out and I find the most interesting, are his family dynamic, especially with his children. He was, at least from the stories we hear and such, he was such a loving father. He really, really adored his children. He really, really spoiled them. Definitely, he was the cool dad, or at least probably thought himself as such, especially thinking back to his own childhood when, he didn't, have the easiest upbringing. His family wasn't super well off. He often had to help his family, work and make ends meet and such. And so I'm sure he, as a parent, wanted to give his kids a very different lifestyle. So you see a lot of that, like, kind of loving father side of him come out when you hear about the home. You also really hear about how, and that extends not only to his own family, but he also was known to play with the children of the neighbors around the area. So it was not only a love of his children, but he also was just a very caring and kind individual to, other people, neighbors, and also kids in the community. He also had a really good sense of humor. Sometimes little bits of it come out in his speeches and stuff, but you also hear about lots of funny stories also about, how he, is very witty and reacts to things kind of on the fly, in his personal life as well. And overall, he was just a very, humble kind of individual. You really get to see, that more human side of him in the home.
Yeah.
Not as
And
much the
that's
politician and stuff or the lawyer, but just a person.
and that's the great thing about the site, right? We saw a little bit of your guys' flag and other artifacts like the coins with pictures in them from the 1860 election. What is that process like to get artifacts, to accept them, to curate them? And have you guys gotten anything cool lately?
I don't think super recently. We do have a limited storage space, so there's only so much, we can have. We, every once in a while we do get, we get contacted by other individuals who do have historic items, which, usually don't belong to Lincoln because, those are, few and far in between. But, sometimes other historical ones are things people think might be related to him. And our curator, Susan, who you saw in the video, she, has a process, to go through with them if, it's something we are considering for a collection, or if we're like, oh, if it is related to the Lincolns in some way, there's a kind of a formal process. But since we have limited storage space, we had to be very selective about, what we can accept. We would love to accept everything, but we can only fit so much in our storage space. I don't think there's anything been acquired super recently, but I know, we've been in talks about sometimes it's not an artifact, but acquiring something similar from the time period. And such like that. I know, I'm not sure how far along it is, but there is talk of getting kind of like boots of the same style and size that Abraham Lincoln would have used, like getting those made. We don't have the originals, but getting those as an example, not exactly as a historic artifact, but kind of something similar to what he would have had. Though those we haven't acquired those yet. But that's, I guess, kind of a related example of something more recent that hopefully will be coming out.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we're running short on time for the Q&A portion. We always like to end with asking you, as our guide for today, if you have any advice for up and coming historians or people that love history in general, maybe how you got to where you're at right now with this site.
Yeah. So I guess as I'll speak also as coming from the national park site, and I'm sure our process might be a little different from some other non-national park related history sites, because they're of course state historic sites as well. But from my personal experience, I really recommend volunteering and looking for internships, especially with the National Park Service. It's very competitive. Everyone wants to work at the national park site, so it can sometimes be a little hard to get your foot in the door. But if you are still a student, there are lots of opportunities at parks, including ours, but for something called the Pathways program, where when you're a student, they give you the opportunity to get kind of like a paid internship while you're still in school. And then that can really get your foot in the door, gets you experience, you get paid. And if you want to join the National Park Service with a historical site, for example, then you already have that experience. But even if you're not in school, or you just can't, put in the time to, work at a site, even volunteering once a week, it starts getting you that experience. It starts getting you those connections. Although I can't speak for state historic sites as much, I do know a couple individuals who have eventually gotten, a position at a state site through first volunteering, because again, it's experience and you start building those connections. I don't know about other sites, but here in Springfield, it's everyone's it's very locally connected. So, if you start volunteering at one place, you can start building up those connections, even if you don't end up at that specific historic site.
That's great advice, Jasmine. Thank you so much for sharing and being with us today and sharing your insight in the site with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone at home for tuning in. We will be back here next week at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as we virtually visit with the National First Ladies Library at the Saxton McKinley House in Canton, Ohio. So I hope to see you here. Bye.